My name is Chris Poire. I'm the program manager and one of the executive committee members at Team Global. So what we do at Team Global, we are founded in 1958 as the European Atlantic Movement, and we are an independent apolitical educational foundation. Team aims to enable young people to act as global citizens and to aspire to leadership roles within their communities. We empower them to consider world issues and to take their part in resolving problems and promoting solutions, something that we'll hopefully do this evening. We work alongside students through our student-led initiative, the International Perspective, based at the University of East Anglia, in which a team of students help their peers and the wider society to become more aware of international issues. Through webinars such as this, we are engaging with students across the UK to think globally on a range of issues from cybersecurity, global inequality, and in the case of this webinar, the importance of aid development in British foreign policy. So we have the pleasure of being joined this afternoon or this evening by Ryan Baldry. So thank you very much to Ryan for spending some time with us this evening. Since 2013, Ryan has had a front row seat in some of the most game-changing political moments to face the United Kingdom, from the 2015 general election campaign to the 2016 EU referendum and the 2019 Conservative Party leadership. Ryan has worked alongside significant political leaders since he left university in 2015. His career has revolved around SW1 even, and the world of Westminster politics, from beginning as an intern in the summer of 2013 at the Conservative Party HQ to running the Parliamentary Office for a government minister. He has gained incredible experiences of working alongside MPs, peers, businesses and charities, as well as government and the civil service. Alongside this, Ryan has also established the first ever networking group for staff for Conservative MPs and peers, which organises events and operates on a number of platforms, which brings together staff from within Parliament and constituencies around the UK. Currently, Ryan is now the communications manager for the Coalition for Global Prosperity, which brings together political, military, business and faith leaders who believe that an effective development budget alongside an active diplomatic and defence strategy keeps Britain at the forefront of saving lives, alleviating poverty, and bringing freedom, security and prosperity to those that need it most. So Ryan, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for having us once again.
No, thank you, Chris. Absolute pleasure. So yeah, I thought what I'd do is just give you a bit of a background in sort of what I do at the moment, because Chris kind of covered it all quite well, I think, for what I've done beforehand. So just bringing back so many flashbacks and trauma there from those events. But yeah, so at the moment, as Chris said, I'm the communications manager for the Coalition for Global Prosperity. We're a not-for-profit working in the field of international development. We're not one of the traditional NGOs that you may know, sort of like Save the Children, WaterAid, etc. We don't work specifically in areas on the ground. We focus more of our efforts on educating policymakers, parliamentarians on the benefits of UK development and trying to persuade those that are more skeptical of development. Those tend to be more on the Conservative side of Parliament, but there are also aid skeptics and things around in Labour as well, and the other opposition parties. So as communications manager, I'm responsible for kind of bringing together all of our external output from the organisation. So whether it comes to putting people on the media, whether it's producing op-eds and papers, conducting opinion polling around the UK, whether it's putting out a podcast, which I also do, so which is quite fun, where I speak to members of Parliament and business leaders, former military officials, things like that, about how what development is, how it's important to them, what global Britain means to them, things like that. So yeah, that's my role, and I've been in it for just about a year now after leaving Parliament, just during the COVID, or towards the middle, I guess, of the COVID pandemic. So yeah, it's where I am now, and looking forward to sort of taking all your questions and hearing thoughts and things, and hopefully should be a really good discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Ryan. And yes, should be really insightful. So I've got a few questions prepped to perhaps warm us up before we get into the nitty gritty. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free, as I said, to pop them in the chat, or if you'd like to ask Ryan yourself, feel free to raise your hand and you'll be invited to take the floor. As well, if you want, feel free to pop on your camera if you dare to speak as well. So my first question for Ryan really is obviously at the moment, particularly this afternoon, we had another government reshuffle, and I noticed when doing the research on the Coalition for Global Prosperity, the chief exec Ryan Henson stated that under Global Britain, we should seize opportunities from Brexit. I was wondering perhaps what exactly are these opportunities, and do you think our new Minister for Brexit Opportunities, Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg, will deliver these?
I knew you'd start with that one.
A nice light one to start us off.
So basically, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg is no vocal supporter of international development, I think it's fair to say, and probably won't surprise anyone. So he's definitely one of the people that we're sort of keen to work with and show that international development isn't just what you can read on or in the Daily Mail or something like that when something happens to go wrong or a project fails, you know. So first off, that's sort of where I think we can leave it on the Jacob Rees-Mogg front. Generally though, talking about, you know, seizing the opportunities from Brexit, I wasn't necessarily a Brexiteer. It's quite clear from my past experience. You know, I worked on the Remain campaign. So, but you know, we are where we are. Let's just deal with it. So, I think that one of the main things that international development can do to really take advantage of leaving the EU is, while we're trying to redefine what Global Britain means on the world stage, it's actually a really good opportunity for us and for organisations like ours to really pitch for where we should be on the world stage, what we should be doing, what our role should be, what our values are. And that work's kind of stalled over the last 2 years, obviously, because of the pandemic. So we didn't really see much detail around what Global Britain meant, what its strands were. We've seen some really good sort of like broad ideas, I guess, from the government. The Prime Minister, some of his main focuses, he's been really quite good at driving things like education of women and girls and protecting them from violence, slavery, things like that. So there are areas, I think, where Global Britain can work quite well outside the EU, and we just have to work a lot harder to try and make sure that development doesn't slip down the agenda. It looks so far that, you know, developments, although the aid budget was reduced at the last budget, it's still been quite an important part. Now it's been back in the Foreign Office. We think it's quite, you know, personally, I think this is quite useful. It's bringing together different strands of foreign policy that we didn't necessarily, that were more traditionally siloed beforehand. We can build development into more of these future trading relationships that the UK are building around the world, whether that be investment in infrastructure, supporting small and local businesses to flourish and become trading partners of the future. You know, I think there are plenty of opportunities out there. We just have to make sure, and it's, you know, partly on organizations like ours and people like me that, and even I guess organizations like, you know, Team Global, to actually kind of push what we want to stand for. And I think that's one of the main opportunities that we have, to kind of show, you know, we've got a slogan of Global Britain as a force for good. Thankfully, I wish I could take credit for it, but I can't. It's language that the government has also been using in all of their documents and policy reports and things like that, and how they see Global Britain. So yeah, we just have to try and push forward. And that now we appear to be coming towards the end of the pandemic. We can now start looking again and seeing, you know, what do we do? What do we stand up for? And what will the UK be on the world stage? You know, how do we flesh out being a force for good? And I think that's kind of one of the main opportunities we have. It's almost, you know, a blank canvas here to define us as a country, an independent country, if you will.
Brilliant, thank you. And I suppose you mentioned sort of with the development budget being slashed. How would you perhaps classify the UK's reputation in terms of global development? As we're a force for good, would you say that we're a global leader in this aspect? Or would you say sort of even Brexit, or sort of even, you know, current or past governments have perhaps taken a step back in terms of that sort of global leader status?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one, and to obviously when the aid budget was cut from 0.7% to 0.5, that was disappointing. There's no two ways around that. That was quite a blow. We were pleasantly surprised when at the last budget the Chancellor committed to reinstating that. We'll watch it carefully because there's still tests to be met, and whether or not the economy recovers strong enough for these tests to be met. So we're cautiously optimistic that we could return back to 0.7. And at the end of the day, it was a manifesto pledge of every elected member of Parliament. So even Conservative MPs, it was in the manifesto. It was there in black and white that the Conservative Party would maintain 0.7. So I think it's definitely on that sort of domestic side. I think there are promising signs. We just have to keep up the pressure and make sure that people are aware of the good that it can do. Now, in terms of the reputation, the UK is still a main player, I think, in international development. It's quite easy to maybe have a look at some headlines or negative press and think that it's all over, we're a small nation, there's nothing else to do with it. I don't think that's the case at all. At the end of the day, we're still spending about £12 billion on international development, which is considerably more than most other countries. So we're still in the top tier of international development donors. So I don't think that can be overlooked. The cut was disappointing, but I think when we go back, we'll be able to, I don't think our reputation will be as harmed as people may necessarily think it is. UK aid still does some incredible work around the world. It helps provide, sanitation. It's helped, when we hosted the G7 last year, and we've made pledges and brought countries together to help fund COVAX to distribute COVID vaccines. So we've got this amazing soft power tool, and I think it is well known. It is world renowned. When you go and visit and see these projects on the ground and things like that, which unfortunately I haven't been able to because travel was forbidden everywhere. But when we start again, the picture of seeing that Union Jack on tents, on food that's medical supplies, that's something that means so much more to these people on the ground who are the recipients of development and aid. And it's stuff that we don't necessarily see here in the UK. And I think that's a problem that the aid sector as a whole needs to address, because it's quite easy to find hostile stories, if you will, of when international development's gone wrong or it's gone to someone it shouldn't have. But you'll be hard pushed to find examples of when UK development has actually saved lives, when it's helped create schools, when it's helped educate women and girls. And that's the kind of stuff we need to press. They're the kind of stories that I think really define who we are as a country. The British people are some of the most generous in the world when it comes to donating their own money, and also with the UK government and its commitment to 0.7, the current blip aside. So I don't think that our reputation is necessarily tarnished. I think when people see what we can do on the world stage as we're a fairly small nation, and we punch well above our weight. I think that's been proven, just recently. And, when we start looking at just last year when we hosted COP, which was one of the biggest, soft power diplomatic events that we can hold. It went a lot better, I think, than a lot of people anticipated. And some of the main recipients of those good outcomes will be developing and island nations. So, I think that you really need to dive through the negative stories, and as important as they are, because they help keep this, they help keep everything honest and keep money going to where it should be. I think we also need to, as it's on people like me in the sector, wider sector, to actually start pushing the successes, because that's when you start seeing that there is more to it than, UK aid does some incredible work, UK funded expertise, does some amazing work around the world that will go unheard of day by day. One example, just off the top of my head, is the Halo Trust. Many people may know it from the famous picture of Princess Diana when she went to visit a minefield. That was with them. They work around the clock, all around the world, removing mines from former war zones and conflict areas, and so that people can start farming land again, so that they can start traveling safely to school again. Now that's an organization based in Scotland, operates around the world, and you don't see stories when they successfully have cleared somewhere so that a brand new school can be built, or when a community starts surviving on its own again because it's able to grow crops again. But that's what, UK expertise is doing on a daily basis. So I think that, there's a much bigger story and a much better story to tell. And I don't think it's the case at all that you can say, the UK's reputation is ruined, because quite frankly, I don't think it is. I think it's the opposite. I think when you come out of the echo chamber of Twitter, the media, and actually see what's happening, it's, there is a lot of positive, and it's not always perfect. You can't, it's not the case at all. It's not a perfect sector. But I think it's, it's definitely one where there's some really good results, and we shouldn't be ashamed to, shout about them, because as British people, we tend to not really like bragging, but on international development, I think it's something that we can, and it's something we should do more of.
Brilliant, thank you, Ryan. And I suppose Team Global actually has a personal connection to Halo as well. One of the previous students that has engaged with Team is actually a policy manager there now. So thank you for that nice little segue. It's much appreciated. And I suppose that you sort of rolling back, you were talking about sort of island nations and these sort of more developing nations. And this kind of rolls on to a question quite nicely from Dan. And he asked sort of, could you go into a bit more detail regarding sort of the idea of development, especially within those sort of poorer, sort of less sort of internationally, I suppose, significant, I suppose you could phrase those nations, with the aim of tackling the climate crisis. Obviously, we've seen it with Tonga recently, but what sort of things are we doing within the sort of UK aid and development to really sort of help push those really pivotal and time critical agendas?
Yeah, so this will be a really interesting one, because at the moment, and I wouldn't expect anyone outside of kind of Westminster or development to know this, but the government are still working on what's called the development strategy, which will be another exciting government white paper, basically outsetting what our priorities will be for the next 10, 15 years. It will go alongside the integrated and strategic review, which looked at UK foreign policy, and then also the defence review as well. And this will set out the kind of key strands of work for UK development policy. Now, I think it's going to be expected that climate change will feature quite heavily in that. And it's an interesting one because, we can deliver aid and we can help places rebuild after natural disasters. We can help them build back, to coin a phrase that I hate using, but actually build back better and stronger. So to be honest, it's quite hard to answer that question until the government's kind of set out what its actual strategy is going to be there. Because until then, we don't really know what the target areas are going to be. There's definitely been more of a pivot to Africa and the African nations. So I'm expecting, quite frankly, a lot of work to be done around resilience, nutrition, protect women and girls' education, things like that, and continued vaccines. They're going to feature quite highly, I think, throughout the strategy as well. But in terms of island nations, I mean, the problem facing them isn't just a matter of, rebuilding after a disaster, because it's not the rebuilding that's an issue. It's the fact that, their land is literally disappearing beneath them. And so that's something where we need to use wider soft power tools to try and promote people to help grow in a more greener and sustainable way, which is difficult because they've seen how we've developed. And I think you can safely say the Industrial Revolution was not green or sustainable. So people see that and think, well, you've done it, why can't we? And we have to be able to say and use things like development, use British expertise, scientists, engineers to basically try and help other nations grow sustainably, so to limit the damage that's being done to these island nations, because we can send as many ships with aid and builders to help rebuild and things, you know, well, whenever it needs to happen, but that's a much more sort of wider international community effort. And I'm hoping that with COP, you know, which was, I think, quite successful, and we still have the presidency of COP until it's handed over to Egypt in November. So I think there's still plenty for us to do on that. And I think UK aid can be quite a useful tool in negotiations with developing states as well. So, you know, we can't, I think there's still hope that we can actually try and bring other nations together in a more sustainable way, so that the damage done to these small island nations that are at risk of disappearing from the map is as limited as possible.
Yeah, thank you. And I suppose going back to that concept of global Britain, which is a phrase that's been chucked about quite a lot recently. Michael asks, you mentioned that the provision of foreign aid was cut from 1% to 0.7%. How do you see that being compatible with this concept of global Britain? And that is something that we actually think about quite a lot. But you know, like I said, the cut is temporary, and we're definitely keeping an eye and hoping on it returning. But even still, you know, and this kind of goes back to what I said, the UK is still a major international donor to international development. You know, I don't think that can be understated. It's disappointing that we weren't at 0.7 anymore, but even with that, you know, the UK people are still donating about 10 to 12 billion pounds every to, you know, these huge international projects. And I still think that the brand Global Britain, there's a risk of sort of saying it too much with no matter behind it, as you'll know with most slogans and things like that. Some are at risk of just disappearing altogether, or something flashier and newer comes along. But I think Global Britain is an interesting one because it's trying to bring together basically all of these strands of foreign policy under one roof. And you know, CGP, my organization, is founded on this principle that development, defense, and diplomacy go hand in hand and should all be working together to help secure UK national interests. Because that's when the UK as a whole is more effective on the world stage. You can see it around the world, and I think that development is one strand of that. And so I think that that's something that, you know, I just don't think that the brand of Global Britain has been diminished by that. It was disappointing, and it may have, you know, it's never something good that you want to say has happened. But at the same time, I think during a pandemic as well, we have to understand that the context of when that cut took place, we were, you know, the government was faced with the unenviable situation of having, you know, hospitals overrun or filling up with COVID patients. We had, you know, entire sectors of the economy on the government payroll, as well as then also trying to support as many small businesses, big businesses as possible through a pandemic. I think, you know, you can't argue that the cut was poor timed or that no one wanted it. You know, at that point, there was a lot going on at home, and you have to kind of balance the two. It wasn't a normal policy decision made in sort of like a normal atmosphere. As much as there are aid skeptics in Parliament and government and things as well, you know, it was still an election manifesto. And I think we need to look a little bit further than the pandemic. And now we're coming out of it, we can now see what the shape of Global Britain will be, because that's what the focus will be on now. So, like I said, I think it was an unfortunate decision, but at the end of the day as well, you've got to look at the context it was taken.
it's quite hard to argue that it was the wrong thing, I think, when you look at the situation that was going on at home.
Brilliant, thank you. And it comes to a question by Maureen now. She asks, obviously, as you mentioned, having defence, having aid, having foreign policy, all in one sort of nice basket is great. But how much of development aid can actually just be boiled down to international trade rather than actually developing and giving, one-off aid or whatever it might be to those in most need?
Yeah, so this is actually really interesting because they do work hand in hand, and they have to. And you can even bring in business into this and wrap it into the trade stuff. So, for example, a member of our advisory council is a businessman, and he has operations in Kenya, and his operations were only possible thanks to expertise from the UK government in helping these developing nations to improve and basically build on their border infrastructure to allow goods to pass through easier, because you had entire lorries of goods and foodstuffs that were going off because they were waiting at these border crossings for so long. You had goods and services that were just coming to a halt as soon as they hit the line because they couldn't cross the border. Now, when you're a developing nation and you've got an economy that's probably quite fragile, not fragile, but still coming to strength, you can't really afford to have that kind of friction. So UK development, UK aid, with expertise from the Home Office and our own border teams and things like that, they went out to Kenya and other nations and helped build up this local infrastructure. Now, it will seem boring to us, and to most normal people, they'll just think, well, that doesn't seem that great. But what that did, it allows more people to travel freer. It means that goods and services can cross the border easier. It means that you can turn up, have something stamped, and off you go, instead of having to wait for days on end for paperwork or some older system to clear. And it meant then that UK businesses were able to set up, improve local economy, provide jobs, provide education, help protect women and girls from sexual exploitation, from modern slavery. And when done right, UK aid can really help open the door to other parts to just entire other opportunities that may not have been there. Because if, it's all well and good having the aid budget, but you've got to put it to good use. And this is another one of the parts where I think bringing it into the wider Foreign Office is actually quite a smart move, because it means then that it's being used alongside other foreign policy objectives. So as much as it does also will boil down to, we need to fill up a Royal Navy ship with water bottles or tents or something like that after a natural disaster, I think there's a much longer term element of international development where you're helping create prosperity, you're helping improve security, which only in turn helps the host nation, but also actually helps us as well. It's in our interest that these nations prosper and are able and given the environment to prosper in, because it helps us so much more when it comes to then not having fewer national security threats, or having, people are less likely to become radicalized if you've got a stable job, you've got a house, you've got healthcare, you've got access to food. So I think there's other parts of it which are often overlooked, and that's kind of why we speak as it, and we wrap it all together within defense, diplomacy and development, because they actually go hand in hand. There was a US former general or defense secretary, and he said, the less you spend on development, the more I have to spend on bullets. And I think that kind of makes the case really well, that development and aid actually helps bring that stability for economies and societies to actually sort of grow and flourish. So I think it's quite a good thing that we wrap it up with the wider foreign policy.
Brilliant, thank you. And just coming on to Maureen's second question before rolling back to Anthony's, she kind of follows on from this, saying that the sort of the UK government policy is to do to those the aid is supposed to sort of help rather than collaborating with these local communities. I'm sure we've seen sort of in recent history, certain Western countries have gone into places that need development, that need aid, and have had unintended consequences, sort of negative consequences, and sometimes it's ended up worse than actually when it started. I suppose Maureen says that it's kind of based on the assumption that we know best as sort of this Western democracy, going into these countries that maybe don't adopt the certain aspects culturally or politically or whatever it might be. How do we avoid sort of making these mistakes and making these assumptions in the future?
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting question, and one that I've kind of been looking at just in the work we do and things like that. And that's how you define what, first off, it's how you sort of look at what development is. So I tend to refer to it, I know you'll have heard me say aid and development, but I tend to refer to it more as development because people don't really look that kindly on aid. It looks like it's more of a handout. When if you actually start looking at what development does, it's actually, you are helping develop these nations, but by working with groups on the ground. So this is one of the parts that is actually, I think, grown out of the point that Maureen's making there, where in the past, you know, you'd have had this, what is known as what's often referred to as, you know, this almost like white savior situation where you'd have European nations or America turning up, giving up food and stuff and then leaving. Now that doesn't help, that doesn't improve infrastructure, that doesn't actually help you know, people develop farmland and things like that. Now I think there's much more of a focus on working with local community groups, working with governments to identify where development funds can be targeted to be more effective. So I think a lot of lessons have been learned about people just turning up and giving aid. I think those days are thankfully more behind us now. And you know, there's a much bigger focus across government and across, I think, across the sector as well, that, you know, you have to trust local people because they know best. There are some incredible groups out there in these countries where they're working on their own to improve the lives of countless people in their communities. And it's not, we shouldn't be going there to try and duplicate it or do it our way. We should be supporting them because they're the ones on the ground. They're the ones that know. And you know, this is also where the UK's diplomatic network and thing comes into its own, because there you've got teams of people working with these local communities on the ground that know the area best. And so, you know, when you combine that kind of expertise, that local community knowledge, I think development can become a really powerful tool instead of a problem. Now, it's not saying aid is perfect, and you know, I think it's quite clear that you can find headlines of when it hasn't worked or when things have gone wrong. I mean, you don't need me to sit here and reel any off. You only have to Google it and you'll probably find the top 10 things from the Daily Mail of when development and aid haven't worked. And there's been some stories where things have gone wrong and they're not great, not good at all. But I think there is a much better focus now where you can look at local communities and work alongside them rather than trying to just ride roughshod over them and say, well, we know best, here we are, you know, we're the British, we're here to help. That's not the kind of thing we're doing. It's really using that local experience and things like that to help drive the development policy. And I think, you know, that's where the best results come in.
Brilliant. And I suppose Anthony sort of goes on to the next topic on the sort of political international agenda is obviously Ukraine, and the issues that are going on there. He asks, are we partnering with any organizations to assist the development in that country, in the Ukraine? And also, sort of leading on from this, he inquired sort of how much does China and the US spend in that development aid? I know that, with China, they have their Belt and Road Initiative program that is, packaged in development, but also, as you said, very much interlinked with defense and foreign policy as well. So is global Britain comparable in a sense, even in soft power in regard to these?
That is quite a chunky question. So let me take the first bit. So on Ukraine, I think that's much more of a security case at the moment than a development case. Personally, we don't work on the ground there, or so I'm not really best placed to answer that question, to be honest, because I think that what the UK is doing at the moment is great. It's actually a really good example of what global Britain can stand for. It's a group of democratic nations standing up for one another and standing up for an ally that's being faced by an aggressor. I think that's kind of what we should be doing. It's what the West and what democracies may have been a bit complacent. So I quite like that this is what we're seeing. But on the wider development front over there, I'm not sure. So I'm not best placed to ask. But on the issue of China, this one is only going to become more and more dominant as an issue as we move forward. As you mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative is, calling it development is very charitable. It's basically bundling developing countries with mountains of debt that they're never going to be able to pay off. It's turning countries away from, I think, democratic values, because China will turn up and say, sure, we'll build this road. We don't have any terms and conditions, but there you go. You now owe us these X billions of pounds. That country is going to be more indebted to them in multiple ways. There's no strings attached to it. And this is the problem that the UK and other Western democracies face that work in development, is that we're giving development to a country. And if you're faced with two offers, you've got China on one hand, and they haven't got any strings, but you've got the West saying, we've got this development money, but with it, we think you should let's start building up democratic institutions. Let's start having a look at human rights abuses. You've got to kind of make that as a package sound more appealing than what China and the Belt and Roads Initiative are offering. And we've already seen, just a day or two ago, we've already seen that China's now partnered with Argentina, I think, and they're now a member of the Belt and Roads Initiative. And we've got to be careful that we're not going to get caught out where we've got this network of countries that are all now indebted to China, because they're the ones who have come in, and they're the ones that have built schools, they've built factories, they've built roads. We have to try and promote that with our democratic values, and democratic institutions are a better way to go, not only for them, but also the local populations. And this is actually a challenge that we're going to face, and we're going to have to start confronting quite considerably, which is where things like bungling it together with trade actually work really well, because it's another option. Then development partners of today could become trading partners of tomorrow, and I think that's something that we need to start, and I think to a point we are working on a lot more. But yeah, the China as an issue and a competitor on the global stage is not going away. And yes, we are a smaller nation, there's no denying that. But as I said, in terms of soft power and on the world stage, I think we still punch significantly further above our weight than others. We've got some amazing tools under our belt, like, we've got things like the Commonwealth, we're on this UN Security Council, we're on most of the big financial global institutions, where we still work with the EU on, plenty of issues as well. So, and as well, with our relationship with the US, India, there's plenty of examples where the UK punches above its weight. And so I think in development, that's no different. But I don't think there is a golden bullet yet for how we counter the issue of China and their sphere of influence, because we're going to have to, I think, come up with something quite quick. Otherwise, we're going to probably lose control of that influence.
Brilliant, thank you. It's yeah, in interesting times ahead of us. Of course, a nice light discussion for a Tuesday evening. And so, just coming back to Dan's point about those sorts of emerging economies, and he says that you mentioned how, you know, we need to respect the fact that we had the Industrial Revolution, and it's unfair to, you know, we had our sort of turn's a horrible way to put it, but, you know, we had our opportunity to exploit, you know, Mother Nature and things like that. So why shouldn't other economies have that opportunity, I suppose, is one way to put it. He says, you know, these countries, these developing economies, are still wanting to, you know, scale their economy, to grow, to offer these jobs that you're talking about, but copying the sort of the Western approach, I should say, is still, you know, is economically, I suppose, now moving away from those fossil fuels and things like that, but also environmentally incredibly damaging. Could you perhaps go into a bit more detail on how we can promote those countries to innovate, to grow in a more green sense without sort of looking like hypocrites ourselves?
Yeah, and this is actually a really good question. And like I said, it's a point that's going to come up a lot, especially as we move forward. And I hate the phrase, but in, you know, this year of COP and etc., it's going to keep coming up. And this is where the kind of point around things like COP were actually quite successful, in that there was a lot of work done around development finance and things like that to actually help emerging economies fund their development and fund their expansion of their economies in a more sustainable way. It wasn't the be all and end all, and there's still plenty of work to do. Like, so, you know, we're not there yet, but there is definitely an understanding that we can't be, you know, we can't be hypocrites, because that is how we developed. It's the point we got to. So we have to now do what we can to make it as easy and affordable, I should say, for emerging economies to also grow at the same or faster rates, but in a way that isn't going to be detrimental to, you know, their neighbor or those small island nations that we were talking about as well. And this is where things like COP are going to be essential to it. And I think the UK can promote some incredible scientists, engineers, and things like that that can help. But at the end of the day, we also need global backing on it, because climate change isn't going to be one thing that we can achieve on our own. As nice as that would be, it's not. We need the global community to also step up and help, because it's going to be a much bigger task than just us alone offering UK development, or it's going to be a lot bigger than just the US stepping in as well. So it's definitely one to keep an eye on as we really get going in this year, while we still have the COP presidency, to see what Alex Sharma does with that. I mean, he's already done some actually really incredible work on bringing nations together, so hopefully he's able to still do that. And, you know, the use of the development budget was quite an effective tool for negotiations and things, I think. So, you know, even with the reduction, I think it was still quite a useful way to help emerging economies develop. But it's, you know, I think that's going to be one of the main challenges of the next few years, is how we do help these emerging economies go, because just on our own, you know, we're not going to be able to, I think, help on the scale needed. It's got to be a global effort. And that's where our leadership and bringing our convening power as a nation can actually come in really handy, and can be a really effective, powerful tool.
And just before I come on to Michael's question, I've noticed sort of in the answer that you've been given, you know, you're mentioning sort of scientists and engineers. I know sort of recently George Freeman, the science minister, announced sort of that we've had a space national strategy. We want to become this science superpower. Do you think that that's where we need to now position ourselves, rather than, you know, I think sort of with you know, Brexit and things like that, I suppose, our sort of foreign policy, and I'm sure I and many have seen sort of significant criticism on sort of the foreign policy and diplomats recently. Do you think that's where we now need to position ourselves to become this sort of scientific leader, where we're sort of innovating, driving these discoveries and new technologies, rather than, you know, sort of that sort of more traditional foreign policy diplomatic route?
Yeah, I mean, first off, government loves a strategy. It just loves strategies and things. It's what drives government. It's what wakes it up in the morning. But I think that George Freeman's point is actually quite valid. I mean, if you look at it, we kind of already are in a superpower in some of these senses. You look at some of the world's most sort of like well-renowned, most successful university or further education institutions. They're in a number of the top 10 are in the UK. And if you think that a nation the size of ours has 2 or 3 in the top 10 of the world's top institutions, I think right there we're already proving the fact that we punch way above our weight and we're on our way to being a superpower. You look where organizations and scientists set up shop, it's here. You know, we had the UK successes and the nation's successes on the COVID vaccine. I think, you know, it's quite easy to look at something and say, oh, it's just wishful thinking, or no, we can't be that. Those days are long behind. But I think when you start, you know, again, you've got to cut through the slogans and look at the detail. I think, and the endless reams of paper wasted to printing off government strategies. But I think once you get past that and actually look at what is being done, I think comments like George Freeman's look actually very reasonable. You know, the UK is home to some amazing scientists, some incredible institutions that have done amazing work and you know, saved lives in the most recent sense. So yeah, I think it's quite a feasible thing, and the UK has so much to offer on the world stage in terms of that science, engineering expertise, that you know, we shouldn't be ashamed of offering that as support and allowing and supporting our great minds and great leaders in those fields to go out and share that knowledge and expertise. I think it's the right thing to do. It drives people to then come study at our institutions. It helps drive UK innovation. You know, it benefits everyone. So I think, yeah, the UK should continue to continue to punch above its weight. It should definitely aim to be a superpower on there. We've got plenty to be proud of as a nation. Like I say, we're very humble and we like to say how bad we're doing all the time and, oh, isn't it awful? But there's actually a lot that the UK has done that we can be proud of. And that's where that's what we need to start doing more of. And it comes back down to my point of, we need to start being more unashamed and pointing out UK successes in the world stage. You know, look at COP. Everyone's comment was, oh, it didn't go as bad as we thought, instead of actually looking at the bits that it did achieve. You know, it's a perfect case of we're almost talking ourselves down the whole time, but actually there's a lot of good work that goes on. And government is not perfect, very far from. I don't think anyone could ever say it is, but there are some things it gets right, and they're the sort of quieter successes, I think, that we have to really help shout about. You know, yes, call it out when something goes wrong, look at something when it's not working, but on the whole, let's actually use some of the successes that we've got under our belt and build on them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ryan. And I'm just keeping note of time. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we've got still a few questions. So hopefully we'll be able to get through these. So coming back to Michael's question, a bit more of a sort of to the point one. He asked, is aid from Britain sort of targeted towards these national governments, or do they work directly with NGOs, or, you know, really to source with those local communities?
Yeah, so a lot of international development now doesn't go to a host nation government. It will actually go through organizations. For example, work being done in Afghanistan, the government recently announced it was basically returning aid spending in Afghanistan to its pre-cut level. And that money isn't going to the Taliban, which is causing the Taliban obviously a lot of problems, but it's going through groups on the ground. It's going through recognized institutions like the UN, or working with the EU and working with the larger donor nations, so it can actually reach those on the ground that need it, rather than being stuck or we're just refused because the Taliban's not recognized, we're obviously not giving anyway, or not unlocking assets. But a lot of aid is actually going directly to the ground or through larger, more recognized international institutions where you have that level of accountability, where you can see where our money is going. And so, yeah, that's something that I think is often not known. We just think that we give nations a nice charity-sized check of here from the British taxpayer, but the vast majority, if not all, goes to on the ground.
Brilliant. And sort of coming on to Maureen's question about sort of working with those local experts. At the moment, the current government's very big on levelling up and that policy. And so sort of from a personal standpoint, I know last year, UNICEF actually started providing funding for UK food programs for the first time. Obviously, growing up myself, UNICEF was always something where it worked primarily with developing countries, in continents like Africa and South America and Asia. I think that really hit home with a lot of people, that UNICEF was working in the UK. So what Maureen asks, do you have the view that we're not, or the government isn't trusting local experts in the UK, in the Northeast, where the government's very much trying to push this levelling up agenda, but really when it comes to it, there isn't really that much levelling up at all?
Well, I'm first off not going to defend or speak for the government. They've got plenty of other very highly paid spinners to do that job for them. So I'm not going to try and guess what the thinking of the Department for Levelling Up is. On the wider point though of, it kind of boils down to does the charity start at home argument, I think, is a safe thing to say. And this is actually a really interesting one, because it kind of boils down to my point earlier of looking at the fact that the government took the decision it did to cut aid during the pandemic. Now, that arguably had plenty of knock-on effects for those recipients of aid, but in a domestic audience, it looked like a good thing to do because you were spending more money at home. Now, we still continue to sort of ask this, and we at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, we do a lot of opinion polling around the UK to see what people think on this issue, because in focus groups and things that we do, this comes up of, well, shouldn't we make sure, why are we spending abroad when we've got homelessness, when we have people using food banks, and it's actually still really interesting that even with this, we recently did a poll, and this one's in Scotland. We asked 1,000 adults across Scotland what their views were on Global Britain and Force for Good agenda, things like that. And at least 40% of them said that the UK has still has a moral obligation to support international development. Another 20 said that we had it was financially the right thing to do as well. And so overall, there is still the British, as it boils down to one of my original points, that the UK, the people of the UK are incredibly generous people. I don't think that can ever be sort of overstated enough, that as a nation, we are generally a nation of givers. We donate to so many causes. We've got this incredible international development budget, and so even with this and problems at home, I think a lot of people also see, when they're able to see what development can do and what it does, and things like the vaccine rollout, people see the benefit in still doing that, because we've literally all lived through what happens when a virus spreads from one country to another, and all of a sudden it's on our shores, and it rips through countries that don't have functioning healthcare systems, or their systems are so fragile the slightest disaster or problem can cripple it. And so I think that's really brought to light how important things like development can be in actually also helping protect the UK. Now, whether or not things were caught off guard or whatever during the pandemic is a different matter, but I think it's still an important thing that the UK people are still, they are, like I say, they're generous people. They want to see the UK being a force for good in the world. They want to know that their money is helping. They want to know that it's delivering results. And I think that it's incredibly telling that even with all of this going on in the world, and even within the UK, people will still support some of the main principles of international development when it comes to improving health infrastructure, when it comes to educating women and girls. So I think, there is a balance to be had, and you have to, obviously, government is there to protect the British people. Ostensibly, it's what it's there for. It's its primary mission. So, of course, it should focus on main domestic issues like making sure no one goes hungry, everyone can heat the home, the basic human rights that we try and promote overseas. But people do still understand, I think, that there's still a wider benefit that comes from international development as well. And it's a harder case to make, I'll grant you, because you can't see the results of international development like you can with domestic policy, which it sort of boils again further down to that point that we have to be a lot louder when we're talking about what UK aid achieves, so that when we are going through harder times, that we can still make the case for development. And also, let's not forget that 0.5 is, it's pegged. It's not a fixed number that we're donating. It's the percentage. So as the economy shrinks, the amount that we are giving overseas shrinks. And then when the good days, it rises again. So I think that's a point that we also need to be a lot clearer about as well, that, the amount we gave on overseas aid was already reducing as the economy contracted during COVID. And so there was the additional cut then when it went down to 0.5 again. So there was already a lot of money coming back or not going overseas because of the state of the economy in the pandemic. So, it's an interesting one, and we have a lot more work to do. But I think from work we've done, there's still a lot of support out there for the main achievements and priorities of international development and what it can do.
Brilliant, thank you. And we'll just run on to the final questions here. So Naveed asks, they're a student studying national defence, and they ask, how do you see the UK's new global development strategy affect the sort of future relations with Iran, obviously not being a democratic country as such? How do you see those future relations playing out?
Well, the development strategy is going to be interesting, and we've been waiting for it for months and months. It's one of those reports that's always just around the corner, or it's going to be released imminently or anytime soon. And so we still haven't seen it, but we shall find out. But I think you can make some pretty good educated guesses when you look at what's said in the other strategies that have come out of the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence on these issues. You've got the pivot to Asia, you've got the focus on Africa, you've got a focus on women and girls, promoting democratic values. So I think you can start piecing together some main gaps there that are still left by the lack of a development strategy. Now, on Iran, I'm not an expert. I'm not gonna speak too much on things I don't know, but that is, again, requires much more of a concerted global effort, I think, than just the UK on its own. And I'd hope that's what any strategy identifies as well. That requires more people coming to the table than just us. We'll be a key part of that, don't get me wrong, but I think that major strategy is going to have to depend on our convening power, on our ability to work with other nations as well as possible, working with these global institutions and frameworks that we have to try and help promote security and return to democratic values and things. And so, I don't want to predict what's going to happen with that, because I wouldn't dare predict further than 24 hours, let alone what's going to happen in a government strategy. But I'd like to think that from what's out there already, you can start to piece together various bits of what the UK government will focus on. And so, like I say, it's quite interesting where the attentions are going. But we'll just have to see how much that's bulked out in the final strategy. And I mean, it's reassuring potentially that Liz Truss paused it when she came in as Foreign Secretary, and then also to kind of take another look at it after Dominic Raab's time. So I mean, you know, we'll take that as a promising sign that there is a lot of work and focus being done on it. Because the development pot, even with the cut, like I say, is still about 12 to 14 billion pounds. That's a significant amount of influence there that the UK can wield alongside other strands of foreign policy. So we need to make sure that the strategy is targeted, it's not ad hoc, and you know, I think that will be kind of the final pillar that we'll get then of what Global Britain is and what our role will be. So I realise I've sort of skirted around your point on Iran, but that's just because I honestly have no idea. I don't think we can predict that. And if that's solved by a government strategy, I will be gobsmacked. So we shall see. And I think sadly, only time will tell on that one.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ryan. And I think that's all we have time for. So thank you very much to everyone for your questions and some really good engagement. So thank you very much. Ryan, do you have any closing words for us this evening?
No, it's just that, you know, I think by joining events like this and stuff, you're already showing that, you know, there is hope out there for the future of global citizens and things like that. So, you know, really support the work that you're doing, Chris, and what your organization does. And, you know, do feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, the rest of them, if you've got any questions and things, or you want to see more of the work that we do, if that's of interest at the Coalition for Global Prosperity. You know, we do polling, we do, you get to hear my dulcet tones on a podcast to your heart's content. So, you know, there's some really interesting stuff going on out there. So yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, do feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a lovely evening, and look forward to welcoming you back on Thursday when we have Jamie Shea talking about the Ukrainian Russian crisis at the moment. So feel free to join us then, and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.